Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. A few weeks ago, Alan May's wife was in severe need of an ambulance due to an attack of pancreatitis. This unfortunately had happened before the doctor's advice, and the doctor's advice was to get to emergency quickly. The call for an ambulance was made, assurances were given, and after a 35-minute wait, a second call was made. Calls were being assessed according to priority, the Surrey senior was told. It took more than 9.5 hours for the ambulance to finally arrive. And the sad part is that it's not an uncommon occurrence. So, to the Premier, can he tell us what immediate steps he is taking to fix this problem so that people are not waiting for an ambulance for 9.5 hours?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Leader of the Opposition for her question. Over the last 4 years, the member will know, we've increased funding and support for the ambulance service by more than 25%. Hundreds of new positions have been created, 273 new positions filled since the fall of 2020. Overall wait times for what are called purple and red calls, the most serious calls, have come down in that period. And that effort has been part of a provincial effort to improve the performance of the ambulance system. It is true, from time to time, there are significant delays in calls in the ambulance system, and those are ones that we consistently investigate. It's also true that, for example, last week on June 2nd, we had the largest day of calls in the third largest, I should say, in the history of the ambulance service. And those days present real challenge for our ambulance paramedics. I think in light of the 2 public health emergencies, our teams of ambulance paramedics are doing an extraordinary job, and we will be continuing to add resources and add staff to the ambulance service, because it is, as the member suggests by her question, when you need it, the most as important a public service as any in the province.
Leader of the Official Opposition, supplemental.
Well, thank you very much to the Health Minister for that response, but let's be clear, this is becoming a much more frequent occurrence. Last week, a woman who had fallen at the Burnaby SkyTrain station broke her hip and had to wait more than an hour for help to arrive. And the frustration isn't being directed at frontline workers. The anger is being directed towards this provincial government. Troy Clifford is the president of the union that represents paramedics, and he lays the blame squarely on management by this province. Here's his quote. "It's tragic when you see something like that. Anytime anybody has to wait when they're in an emergency situation, whether it's critical or not, it's a horrible experience. It really is becoming, sadly, a norm," end quote. So once again, to the Premier, what specific steps is he taking now to fix this mess?
Minister of Health.
Honourable Speaker, I think I answered the question in my first answer. Since the fall of last year, 283 new permanent paramedic positions. In this year, this calendar year so far, 73 all over the province, increasing services to British Columbians. It is true that in the last week in particular, we've had enormous numbers of calls. It is true that the challenges facing our ambulance paramedics in 2 public health emergencies are exceptional, and they put real pressure, not just on the whole system, but on individual ambulance paramedics, who in my view are doing an outstanding job in the circumstances. We respond and investigate every complaint and concern about individual calls, but we do keep every day, and I'm happy to share these with the honourable member, detailed information about responses to calls across the province. On balance, because of the massive investment over the last number of years, 25% increase in the budget of the ambulance service since I became Minister of Health. We have added resources everywhere in the province. Is it perfect every day? Certainly not. And we are very concerned when we hear stories such as the ones relayed by the honourable member, ones that we, of course, are going to follow up and I express my concern and take responsibility for. But what you have to say is the performance of the BC Ambulance Services, the BC Emergency Health Services continues to be, especially in this time, extraordinary, and I'm very proud of our teams.
Member for Kelowna Mission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I do agree with the minister that we do have two pandemics, but we still need more paramedics. Last week came another case, this time an accident victim in Surrey waiting 2 hours for an ambulance. Rajan Maria was in a crash. Firefighters used the jaws of life to gain access, but didn't want to move her over concern of creating a spinal cord injury. An ambulance was called. Everyone at the scene waited and waited and waited some more. Finally, the family was so exhausted from concern, they transported her to hospital on their own. That's simply unacceptable. Residents literally crying out for help want to know, what is the Premier going to do today to fix this mess and ensure that no one else needlessly suffers?
Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, what we've done, not just today, but every day since the Premier became Premier, was increase resources to the ambulance service. Imagine where we would be today if we hadn't increased those resources by 25%, if we hadn't added hundreds of ambulance paramedic positions, if we hadn't added new ambulances and new resources to communities. And absolutely, the challenge facing our ambulance paramedics as people, and we see this reflected in their challenges, and the number of people who have to be off work at times is more challenging with 2 public health emergencies that are facing our province. But response times for purple and red calls, which are our most serious calls, have come down. And we continue to work with our union, with the whole of the BC Emergency Health Services to make things better. The member asked what we're doing. We're hiring more people, we're delivering more ambulances, we're improving services in rural communities, and we're adding dramatically to the budget compared to where it was when I became Minister of Health in July of 2017.
Member for Kelowna Mission, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm glad that the minister brought up what the previous government before the NDP actually did, because the NDP 25%, well, we actually added 170%. And we didn't just add hundreds of paramedics in 4 years, we added 1,000. Those words that were just heard by the minister are cold comfort to the people and families who sit helplessly waiting for an ambulance. It doesn't provide any comfort to the front lines, the firefighters, the police officers, and the paramedics who have to deal with unacceptable delays. Frontline workers have been raising the issue with the NDP government for months, and it's getting worse, not better. As one paramedic put it, and I quote, "The NDP Minister of Health and BCEHS need to be held accountable for their lack of management and improper care in their duty to help BC citizens. Who has to die for a change to happen?" End quote. When will the Premier take this seriously and provide the needed resources to fix this mess before someone does die?
Minister of Health.
Honourable Speaker, we take the concerns of people who deal with health services in BC very seriously, as we do in the cases that have been raised in the media that are being quoted by the official opposition today. But, Honourable Speaker, if the opposition really wants to have a comparison of the investment in the ambulance service over the last 4 years compared to previous, I would be happy to have that discussion. In fact, I'm sure we will in our upcoming estimates, Honourable Speaker. The fact of the matter is that in the period prior to us becoming office, the ambulance paramedics and their union were so disrespected that they weren't even negotiated with as a union. That has changed under our government. The 25% increase, 6.9% on average over 4 years in resources to the BC Ambulance Service, and the 283 positions I referred to are since the fall of 2020. Honourable Speaker, I think it's fair to say that the challenge facing the ambulance service is unlike any that we've seen before. Our communities are more difficult, and they are. as always, to get around. They are difficult to get around. And we've seen in the last week, very significant and increased levels of calls. But in consideration of that, it should be noted that the substance says that the time we've taken for purple and red calls has gone down, and the investment in the ambulance service is extraordinary. It will have to continue to be as we continue to meet the needs of a growing province.
Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, there was some good news in Fairy Creek. The Cheedat, Didadat, Huayet requested a 2-year deferral for logging in the Fairy Creek watershed as well as in the Central Walbran. However, today I won't be celebrating. Too many questions left to be answered. Questions that we'll be watching very closely over the coming weeks to see how this turns out. Fairy Creek has become a flashpoint in this province, Mr. Speaker, and it's a symbol of this government's desire to continue to raise our ancient forests. The announcement today was an announcement made by First Nations, but we all know in this province that it was a result of this government, this BC government's failed forestry policy to protect these ecosystems across the province. What we've seen in Fairy Creek in recent weeks and months simply cannot be the pathway to protecting these sacred places. Through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Forests, will the minister commit to extensive deferrals across British Columbia in line with the government's own panel's criteria and the mapping done by independent scientists to prevent what we've seen in Fairy Creek from happening again?
Minister of Forest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. And the member knows that we all care about old growth. We all care about it, all of us in the House, those across the province, and the member also knows that our government is working hard to ensure that we are protecting old growth. We are fulfilling the recommendations on the old growth report, but I have to remind the member that the number one recommendation was those critically important government-to-government discussions with Indigenous nations. And that's exactly what's happened. The government has been having those confidential government-to-government discussions with the nations, and the member has spoken of the results. And we are now, we've received the request from the chiefs of the Pachidat, the Didadat, and the Huayet First Nations, and we honor their declaration and are pleased to continue those respectful discussions with the nations because we are committed. We are committed to reconciliation, and true reconciliation means meaningful partnerships. So we are moving forward with deferrals. We will have more news in the coming days, and we will have more deferrals this summer.
Member for Saanich North and Islands, supplemental.
This member knows that government wants to cut the old growth. That's what they've demonstrated over the last number of months and years that we've been asking this question. This member knows that this government's also been using the UNDRIP as a shield, putting Indigenous nations out in front, in between the protests and failed forestry policy. This member knows that this government has been signing agreements over the last 2 years, 3 years, most recently a whole bunch that have been signed in 2021, further making this situation of protecting old growth more difficult. Anybody who's been paying attention to forestry in this province is able to see it. I'm glad that there's temporary reprieve in Fairy Creek, but it's a painful way to achieve it. An exceptionally painful way that we've been feeling day in and day out as Indigenous people have been put in the middle of this. Logging corporations and British Columbian government are logging these at-risk forests in our province. I hear there are cut blocks available going up in the Namend for auction. Kwakiutl Hereditary Chief David Knox, the minister is in her message box talking about hereditary and doing the work. Hereditary Chief in Kwakiutl, Hereditary Chief David Knox saying that they've been wanting this premier to meet with him. Silence. Hereditary chiefs in the Gitxsan are trying to restrict access to their territory. Those measures have been removed. This government, like the provincial governments of the past, are using Indigenous people as a scapegoat. And I can say it because I know how it feels. I know how it smells. I know how it tastes. This is the life that I've lived, Mr. Speaker. Through you to the Minister of Forests. The co-chair of her own strategic review panel said, if this continues, we are going to see ferry creeks happen all the time. My question is to the Minister of Forests. What is she doing today to defer logging in old-growth stands across British Columbia to ensure that the situation that we've seen in Ferry Creek doesn't happen again in our forests?
Minister of Forest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I understand the member's passion, but we are working and we are doing the work to ensure that we are protecting ancient forests. Our government has received several requests from First Nations to implement further deferrals. We have responded to all of the incoming requests, and we are committed to working with the nations. And some of those conversations are already underway. Engaging with First Nations on old growth was the #1 recommendation, and we will continue to ensure that that happens because that's what we're doing. We are having those discussions with the rights and title holders. And I will remind the member that there's something else that the co-author of the report also said. He said, I know that the government is working on all of the priority recommendations. It won't happen overnight. And he goes on to say, I've said this before. We've lived in this paradigm for almost 200 years in this province now, and our whole culture is centered around this. It's going to change. It's just a matter of how fast we can make the change and how we can manage the transition. And Mr. Speaker, we are doing just that. We are ensuring we do this properly. We are ensuring the worst thing we could do is rush these critical decisions, rush these discussions without ensuring we're doing it properly, listening and working and having those discussions with the Indigenous nations, but also bringing in other people who this is critically important to. The communities that are affected, the workers who are affected, and of course the companies who are affected. You know, we need to ensure that we have those discussions, and we know we are also reaching out to environmentalists because we have to bring everyone to the table, Mr. Speaker, because that is the way we are going to ensure that we protect these ancient forests.
Member for Abbotsford South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, it would seem the Premier has a problem admitting when he's made a mistake. For weeks, he refused to provide veteran groups like the Legions, the Army, Navy, and Air Force clubs access to the circuit breaker funding, even though those veteran groups were experiencing all the same problems as the other hospitality groups. Finally, he caved. Yet, he managed to botch and bungle it once again. There was now funding for the Legion, but none for the Anavets. There were only 2 groups, Mr. Speaker. 2 groups to remember to get this right. Will the Premier stand up today and do the right thing and provide Anavets with the respect they deserve and ensure they have the same access to funds as the Legions?
Minister of Jobs and Economic Recovery.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And as we've canvassed this topic already, I'll share the answer with the member. The Royal Canadian Legion wrote to the government expressing concern that they also need financial supports. We reached out to the Federal Ministry of Veterans Affairs, discussed with them about the need for financial supports to be provided by them. They notified us that they have given $9,000 to every single association here in British Columbia to support them. We also included an additional $10,000 for the 145 branches of the Royal Canadian Legion who wrote to us, of course, asking for the supports. Since then, I've spoken to the Federal Ministry of Veterans Affairs about them to need to match our dollars to ensure that more organizations can get the dollars. Those conversations are ongoing.
Member for Abbotsford South, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's just astounding how difficult it is to get to a yes. But anyway, here we are the day after the anniversary of D-Day, And the Premier still has no concern for the Army, Navy veterans organizations who need funding now. They're not asking for special rights, Mr. Speaker. They're asking for what they deserve. They're asking for the same funding that the Legions rightfully qualify for. So here's a question from the provincial command of the Anavets, and I quote, "Could you please explain why the oldest veterans organization in Canada was excluded from this? I find it not only unfair, but so disrespectful to our organization and all of our members," end quote. Now, the minister can come up with all of the answers that he wants, but I noticed in that he did not call reaching out to the Anavets. How would he or the Premier respond to the Anavets? Will this Premier give them the money they need?
Minister of Jobs and Economic Recovery.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, I've highlighted this already for the member, and I'll do it again. We've reached out to the Federal Ministry of Veterans Affairs, who is responsible for providing financial supports to all our veterans organizations. They have notified us that they've provided $9,000 for every association in the province. We've let them know that we've put an additional $1.5 million, and we expect them to come to the table for additional dollars. There's a lot of organizations, Honourable Speaker, in this province that need supports. We're proud of the supports we've been able to put in place, and we're going to continue to do that good work to support as many organizations as
Members. We can. Member for Caribou-Chilcotin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is deadline day today in British Columbia. The deadline to apply for anchor attraction funding is today, but the IPE fair in Armstrong is still excluded. When they went to apply for funding, the IPE discovered that you have to first call to request an application, which you will receive if the ministry believes that you might qualify. They are saying that the program is, quote, convoluted and lacks transparency. Many attractions in BC are now discovering on the deadline day of funding that the Premier has bungled yet another program. Why is the Premier using such a convoluted application system for this anchor attraction funding? Please answer the question.
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. A couple of weeks ago, the Premier and I announced $50 million in grants, not loans. It is targeted funding to assist anchor attractions in the Lower Mainland, in rural communities, and tourism operators. The ministry fully disclosed the eligibility criteria on the website. There have been so far 84 completed applications within the hands of the ministry, and they're going to review the applications. That is transparency. This is a call to action from the Tourism Task Force, from the industry, saying that we need this relief. It's $50 million in a grant, not a loan, and the ministry is going to decide based on the criteria that was fully transparent to the public how it's going to help really much needed anchor attractions all across BC, because as the restart continues, people are going to get outside and play, and we're going to need those attractions more than ever. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Premier wants to spend $500 million of taxpayers' money through his MBC high-risk venture capital scheme. Taxpayers have a right to transparency. They have a right to know how their $500 million is being spent and what the risks involved are. But the Premier doesn't want British Columbians to know. He doesn't want taxpayers to have access to MBC's business plan or investment impact scorecards, and he's refusing to make MBC subject to freedom of information. So my question is this: with $500 million of public funds at risk, will the Premier direct his Minister of Citizen Services to immediately subject this high-risk venture capital scheme to FOI?
Minister of Jobs and Economic Recovery.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Again, we've canvassed this question many times in the House, so let me share with the member again. When the opposition now, when they were in government, they created the Immigrant Investment Fund. At that time, no business plan was released. In fact, they precluded them from FOI. In fact, the member from Kelowna, who then was the minister, wrote that, in fact, public transparency is achieved through operational reporting under the BCIF annual report. That was his response to why they left FOI out. They were told at that time that it would potentially have a chilling effect for investments. They chose to leave it out for that reason, and they clearly articulated that the annual report was sufficient. So not only did they not have the FOIs, they didn't release a business plan at all. They didn't release a business plan for the tech fund either, Honourable Speaker. And so the honourable member can continue to ask these questions, but we're doing the due diligence to continue to engage with the business community, the venture capital community about the fund and hear their concerns, and we'll make decisions accordingly.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson, supplemental.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, there's less transparency with the Premier's high-risk venture capital scheme than there was with Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. That's the reality. And for the minister to stand up and continuously compare in BC to the BC Immigrant Investment Fund is frankly ridiculous, and he should know it. In BC is the Premier's high-risk venture capital scheme that involves $500 million of taxpayer funds. The BC Immigrant Investment Fund involved, wait for it, private funds. But don't take my word for it. It was actually last week that the Minister for Citizen Services said, and I quote, "The source of the BC Immigrant Investment Fund is not taxpayer funds, but rather sourced from immigrant investors through a federal program." End quote. Mr. Speaker, it's time for this government to provide the transparency that taxpayers expect and deserve. So when will the Premier do that and make sure that NBC is subject to the Freedom of Information legislation in this province?
Minister of Jobs and Economic Recovery.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and gives me an opportunity to talk about how proud we are of NBC here on this side of the House, Honourable Speaker. $500 million, Honourable Speaker. The member opposite calls the member from opposite calls that the fact that this fund has triple bottom line, he calls it strings attached. Imagine that. Imagine having an investment fund that supports BC companies, not companies in other jurisdictions, BC companies that are helping people, planet, and profit. That is not strings attached, Honourable Speaker. That's helping drive the growth that we want to see here in this province. It's tilting the field to ensure that we get green, clean economic growth for this province, Honourable Speaker. Modeled off of Denmark, modeled off of Ireland, modeled off of Singapore.
Listen to the answer,
jurisdictions
please.
all over the world that are leading in innovation, Honourable Speaker, are using the similar style of funding. We're proud of this fund. This is going to help drive economic growth in this province. And one day that member will stand up and talk about how great this fund was for this province, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson,
well,
another supplemental.
Mr. Speaker, while the minister is applying for the lead role in the sequel to The Big Short, he might want to know that the Information and Privacy Commissioner, or be reminded of the fact that the Information and Privacy Commissioner has sounded the alarm on NBC, making it clear that none of the government's excuses for refusing to subject NBC to FOI are valid. None of them are valid. And the minister can stand here and he can talk about how proud he is. Well, only he would be proud of not providing the business plan for a $500 million high-risk venture capital scheme, providing access to that business plan to British Columbians. Only he would be proud of that. Only he would be proud of saying to British Columbians, no, you don't have a right to look at the impact investment scorecards that are used to rate each investment. And only this minister seems to be willing to stand up and say, I'm proud of the fact that we're not going to subject any of the above to freedom of information. It's unfair to the people of British Columbia, who deserve transparency again on a $500 million in high-risk investment fund. So again, to the Premier, will he fix his transparency problem when it comes to NBC? Will he subject NBC to freedom of information legislation? And therefore, will he allow British Columbians to have the access that they deserve to the information pertaining to $500 million of their money, public money, that will be used in this high-risk scheme?
Minister of Jobs and Economic Recovery.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I appreciate the member has a PhD in FOI laws in this province, giving us lectures on how FOI should be done, given his experience in the triple delete scandal. But that's okay, Honourable Speaker. We'll continue to humour him in his suggestions. I just had a letter written to me last week, Honourable Speaker, from the Canadian Venture Capital Private Equity Association. They are recommending, their recommendation is that the government refrain from adding NBC as a public body under Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. Subjecting NBC to FIPA raises potential of creating chilling effect for NBC in regard to securing such investments and hinder NBC from attracting investment partners, both domestic and international, which in turn undermine the fundamental objectives behind this public investment.
Members, the question was asked. Now the time for answer. Minister will continue.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. This is the Canadian Venture Private Equity Association. There's more letters coming to me. We continue to engage with all of the partners around this, Honourable Speaker. And again, I'll highlight to all the members, this is a historic $500 million investment, which will help drive economic growth here in this province. We're very proud of it. It's going to do big things. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
The bell ends question period.